On Tuesday, during a meeting in the Australian capital of Canberra, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that, after nearly a decade of on-off negotiations, the EU and Australia had finally agreed a free trade deal. This deal comes hot on the heels of the EU's agreement with Mercosur, and is the latest in a series of trade deals the EU has recently finalised in the Indo-Pacific, including one with Indonesia in September 2025 and one with India in January 2026. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this new EU-Australia trade deal, and why, even if it's unlikely to have a massive impact on either side's GDP, it still makes some strategic sense. Is social media as dangerous as alcohol? While you might instinctively say no, there's a historical precedent that suggests social media bans for children might be a necessary move. Read our thoughts on the debate gaining traction across the world in the latest edition of Our magazine. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's start with a bit of context about how this deal actually happened. Negotiations first began way back in 2018 under Australia's then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and the EU's then Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. In theory, this deal should have been relatively easy to do. After all, as two similarly developed economies, the EU and Australia already have relatively similar standards and regulations, and already do quite a bit of trade with one another. In 2024, for instance, while Australia was only the EU's 20th biggest partner for trading goods, the EU was Australia's third largest trading partner after China and Japan, having recently overtaken the US. However, like many of the EU's trade deals, negotiations were held up by the agricultural sector, with farmers in the EU fretting that a free trade deal would allow them to be undercut by Australian producers, and Australian farmers resisting European rules on so-called geographical indications, or GIs, which basically say that farmers are only allowed to label their products with certain names if they actually originate from a certain place. For instance, in the EU, you can't call your sparkling wine champagne unless it comes from the Champagne region in France. But, for understandable reasons, Australian producers didn't want to be subject to these sorts of rules. Negotiations actually collapsed in October 2023 over these exact sticking points, but were revived last year in the wake of Trump's return to office and his various trade wars. As you probably already know, the EU is currently facing a 15% tariff on all European exports to the US, and while Australia hasn't been hit with any additional tariffs, it's still facing the 10% flat tariff that Trump has imposed on all imports coming into the US. This has hurt European and Australian exporters, and given both sides an extra incentive to diversify their trading relationships by signing new free trade deals. Anyway, to get the deal over the line, the EU essentially agreed to reduce tariffs on a whole load of agricultural imports from Australia, albeit with quotas on sensitive products like beef and lamb, and in return, Australia agreed to some of the EU's rules on geographical indications, albeit not all of them. Specifically, the EU agreed to annual quotas of 30,600 tonnes for Australian beef, phased in over 10 years, 25,000 tonnes for lamb and goat, phased in over 7 years, 8,500 tonnes for rice, phased in over 5 years, and 35,000 tonnes for sugar. On the other side, Australia agreed to geographical indications for about 400 products, although a number of well-known GIs, including Feta, Gruyere and Prosecco, aren't covered by the agreement, which means Australian producers will still be able to use these labels in certain circumstances. There's also a safeguard mechanism allowing both sides to impose temporary measures within the first 7 years if a sudden increase in imports leads to major disruption in either market. Nonetheless, farmers on both sides were apparently unhappy with the final agreement. Copa-Corsega, the EU's influential farmers' lobby, put out a statement saying that, in a post-Mercosur context, the cumulative impact of successive trade agreements makes these concessions unacceptable, while in Australia, the National Farmers Federation described it as extremely disappointing. The National Dairy Association described it as neither free nor fair for Australian dairy, and Meat and Livestock Australia called it the worst ever free trade agreement for the Australian red meat industry, noting that the agreed quotas were far below what the EU had offered other trade partners in recent agreements. In the recent trade deal with Mercosur, for instance, South American beef exporters got a 99,000-tonne quota, more than 3 times what Australia got, and New Zealand's 160,000-tonne quota for lamb and goat is more than 6 times what Australia got. Anyway, outside of agriculture, both sides agreed to reduce tariffs in other sectors, with something like 98% of goods now enjoying tariff-free trade. However, because both sides only had minimal tariffs in place beforehand, according to the latest WTO data for instance, in 2024 the EU's average tariff rate on a trade-weighted basis was just 2.8%, while Australia's was just 2.6%. This deal is expected to have a pretty minimal impact on overall GDP. Australia, for instance, estimates that, by 2030, the deal will increase its GDP by about 8 billion Australian dollars, or less than 0.5%, while the EU estimates it'll increase its own GDP by just 4 billion euros, less than 0.1%. Nonetheless, its supporters would argue that focusing exclusively on its impact on GDP probably undervalues the deal, because it overlooks the benefits for Europe's economic security. For context, in the past few years, the EU has been increasingly anxious about its dependence on certain countries for certain strategically important commodities. Most obviously, the EU became very anxious about its dependence on Russian oil and gas after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Although some European politicians are now anxious about Europe's growing dependence on American hydrocarbons. But European policymakers are also anxious about their newfound dependence on China for both certain technologies and commodities, including, most notably, rare earth metals, where China dominates across the entire supply chain. The basic problem for Europe, however, is that, as a continent, it isn't geologically blessed. It doesn't have massive deposits of either hydrocarbons or most critical minerals, which means the EU's best bet for mitigating its various dependencies is diversification. In other words, finding other trading partners who could at least partially fill the gap. Australia is a pretty perfect fit in this respect. It has incredible mineral wealth, with copious reserves of rare earths, iron, bauxite, lithium, gold, uranium and zinc, and is generally considered a reliable trading partner. The deal gives the EU better access to these commodity exports and allows European companies to buy minerals at the same price as those in Australia. Similarly, this deal should help ameliorate Australia's anxieties about its economic dependence on China. For context, while Australia isn't as worried as Europe about securing access to commodities, in recent years, Australian policymakers have become increasingly anxious about their wider economic dependence on China, which is now Australia's largest trading partner by some distance. A deeper economic relationship with the EU could help mitigate this dependence and provide an alternative market for Australian exporters if the trading relationship with China is disrupted for some reason. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it'll be shipped to you immediately, and if you buy a digital edition, it'll land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there using code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles.
The New Age of Empires. Written and read by Georgina Finley.
If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That gets you a copy of the magazine, but also access to TLDR Party, our new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series Leaders and Losers and our upcoming documentary we're recording in Greenland right now. They get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.